Welcome everyone to the webinar, to our monthly webinar at the Wilberforce Institute. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Laura Sandy to you. I know that there are probably still a few people joining, but by the time I've had my introduction, you all should be ready to hear the main event today, which is Laura's very interesting talk. It's a great pleasure to mention Laura Sandy, a great friend of the Wilberforce Institute. And a great friend of myself as well, since I've known Laura in her many manifestations for quite a long time. Laura did her PhD at the University of Manchester and has taught at a variety of institutions in Britain, Oxford Brookes, Keele University, and she's now a senior lecturer at the University of Liverpool, as well as the director of the Centre for the Study of International Slavery at the University of Liverpool. She works on a variety of topics to do with American history, both in the 18th century and in the antebellum period, and in particular works to do with plantation society and with the history of slavery. She's a writer, author of several important articles on topics to do with plantation economy of South Carolina and Virginia, and she has written an outstanding book which was published by Routledge in 2020 or 2019, I think it was 2020, which was on overseers in the plantation world of Virginia and South Carolina in the 18th century. So she's doing some important work on slavery and on plantation economies in general. And she's going to be talking about us today about a fascinating new project that she has, which is on slave stealing. And her title today is Casually Lost and Commonly Stolen, Slave Stealing in American History. In regard to questions, which Laura has graciously agreed to answer, if you could either type a message with a question that you would like to present, or if you could mention in the chat session to the right of your screen that you'd like to present a question, we will be able to do both of those at the conclusion of this webinar. So it's a great pleasure, Laura, to welcome you to the Wilberforce Institute and to look forward to your paper on slave stealing in American history. So over to you, Laura.
So I'm hoping my screen will be shared. Oops. So many different windows. Hold on a second.
Yeah, you're sharing, Laura.
There we are. Great. Well, I just want to say before I start, a really big thank you to Judith and Maria for helping to set this up, and of course for Trevor inviting me, all three of you. So thank you so much. Trevor, I don't know if you remember this, but my first ever academic paper I gave in the first year of my PhD, you were there. So you obviously weren't put off too much to invite me along to talk about my newer work today. So this paper or project, slave stealing, I've been working on it on and off for a number of years while doing other projects. It's my sole focus now, so any input anyone can give me, I might even have questions too. It's a sort of wild project that straddles the whole of the South and the whole of slavery in America. So it's a big endeavour, and I'll try and explain or give an overview of all the different parts of the project, and it will be a sort of whistle-stop tour, but hopefully we can have more discussion and debate after the paper. So in my paper entitled Casually Lost and Commonly Stolen, Slave Stealing in American History, I'm going to offer a broad overview of a variety of activities that constituted slave stealing. And I'm going to introduce you to the array of people who could be prosecuted for this crime. The project spans from the colonial period until the end of legalized slavery in North America. I found that looking at slave stealers or all the various practices that amounted to slave stealing offers many new insights into the lived reality of slavery. Thus, this research both places new faces and experiences into the history of slavery, and it broadens our understanding of how slavery functioned in North America. It highlights how deeply embedded and complicated the institution was, and using slave stealing as a lens through which to re-examine slavery in American society, it further emphasizes the persistent daily transgressions, challenges, and protests that characterized many people's responses to race slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries. So slave stealing itself has yet to attract significant attention in the quite extensive historiography on American slavery. Although it's been acknowledged in one or two studies, in fact, the great study Slave Runaways by John Hope Franklin mentions this in passing. So although it's been flagged up a couple of times, there's been no in-depth study about the theft of the enslaved, which was actually, from looking at many, many court records and cases, a very common occurrence. In fact, research that has dealt with kidnapping under American slavery and illegal trafficking under slavery has almost exclusively focused on what's been called the reverse Underground Railroad, which is the name given to the practice of kidnapping free African Americans, often from northern states, and selling these free people into slavery. The most famous case is, of course, Solomon Northup, on which the film 12 Years a Slave was based. Nevertheless, slave stealing, so the stealing of the enslaved from their owners, is an activity that stretches across the history of North American slavery. Thus, protecting slave owners from this theft was a prominent early concern of the lawmakers of colonial America. Sustaining security of ownership and guarding against the possibility of the theft of slaves remained a pressing and ever more urgent issue during the 19th century and in the decades leading up to the Civil War. The significance of slave stealing as a destabilizing phenomenon within society ran deep. Incidence of slave stealing was high, and the cases themselves, the way in which the culprits were dealt with, and the public and political responses are extremely revealing. Individuals, small groups, and larger gangs were accused, arrested, and placed on trial for the range of crimes that amounted to slave stealing. Slave stealers and the aggrieved parties, whose enslaved property had been stolen, persistently appear in legal, government, and plantation records. They appear in newspapers, in slave narratives, in oral histories, and a variety of other sources. The theft of human property was clearly a complicated crime, and those involved in this underground slave trade, as I have termed it, came from a variety of backgrounds. Their motives were varied. Criminals greedy for profit, friends and family members acting on personal bonds of affection, and abolitionists and conductors on the Underground Railroad, who were moved by ideological commitment to ending slavery. Yet the slave-owning class, lawmakers and politicians made little distinction between the motivations of those who would attack individual property rights and the institution of slavery itself. The criminals were ardently pursued, and slave owners frequently ended up in courts too, seeking restoration and compensation for the theft of the enslaved people and their labour. In some instances, slave stealing was indicative of the largely unrecognised extent of organised crime in the American South. Crime that thrived in the shadow of slavery, with networks that linked the legal slave trade to criminal enterprises. These spread across communities, states, and the entire southern section. The extensive and illicit underground slave trade, where kidnap, forgery, and fraud determined possession of the enslaved, existed alongside the legal domestic slave trade. The human dramas concerning motivation and culpability for slave stealing, including the part and experiences of the enslaved, are a stark indicator of the inability of lawmakers to create a robust legal framework, one that both secured slavery as a system in which the enslaved were mere chattel, while also recognizing that they were human beings who were capable of autonomy and capable of resistance. Broadly then, investigating slave stealing over time demonstrates that the everyday lives of the free and the unfree, men and women, black and white, were frequently moulded by behaviours that transgressed custom and the law, and challenged many of the assumptions upon which racialized slavery as a system was rested. Indeed, it can be argued that slave stealers and slave stealing heightened anxiety and volatility over slavery, shaped American political thought, and indeed significantly contributed to the rising sense of insecurity over the future of the institution of slavery in the United States, the growth of sectionalism in the South, and finally led to the outbreak of civil war. So there's my title page. I'm going to come back to this advert, £500 reward for an enslaved person who was allegedly stolen. Kidnappers and horse thieves, so gangs going hand in hand with other crimes that I'll talk about. So I've just put up a slide there of all of these terms in blue come from the actual legal codes and laws that were passed, and in the red box are some of the penalties, and I'll come on to these in a second, and then some of the names in contemporary 18th and 19th century in the box at the bottom that slave stealers were referred to, formally and informally. So from the 17th century and the moment slavery arrived in the North American colonies, laws were created which both attempted to secure the existence of slavery and protect slave owners against slave stealing. Naturally, men considered slave stealing a heinous crime. Some considered this, and have actually written about it in their sort of responses to slave stealing, that stealing human property was worse than killing a fellow citizen. Those who trafficked slaves purely for profit, and ideologically driven resistors and abolitionists alike, were accused of slave stealing. Even men and women who simply helped, sheltered, or were found in the company of the enslaved and runaways, and who certainly didn't consider themselves resistors or abolitionists, could be prosecuted too for the crime and found themselves in court. The first laws that actually dealt with both the theft of the enslaved also dealt with the theft of indentured servants, and I can talk about that perhaps a bit more if anyone's interested later. By the early 18th century, the crime was deemed so serious that those convicted were threatened with, in quotes, death without benefit of the clergy. However, by the 19th century, the laws moved away from the death penalty and instead punished the perpetrators with jail time and fines. Nevertheless, punishment remained harsh and increased in severity as the sectional crisis deepened. For example, in 1849, in an effort to ward off those who would attempt to attack the South's peculiar institution of slavery, the Virginia General Assembly agreed that any person who stole slaves or concealed fugitives, so runaway slaves, should, in quotes, pay the sum of $500. This was an extremely hefty fine and almost 5 times that of the fine imposed earlier in the century. By the 1850s and into the 1860s, the fine for slave stealing was anything from $10 to $50 for every day of harbouring or holding an enslaved person. The legislative debates that took place and the laws that were passed by local and federal government clearly expressed some of the anxieties of those who owned human property, and they represented a willingness to swiftly and stringently penalise anyone who could be accused of stealing slaves. As slavery evolved and spread, so too did the legal codes regarding theft. They increasingly encompassed all manner of activities. So, as I said, you can see them on the slide there. I'll read some out. So, to steal and entice away, the abduction and stealing of slaves, larceny of a slave, kidnapping, conveying, carrying away, removing, secreting, harbouring, decoying of a slave, to purloin and decoy enslaved property, aiding and abetting slaves to escape or evade their labour. These were all considered to be forms of slave stealing. The increasingly severe penalties are, therefore, also a useful reminder that the world view of slave owners by the 19th century was shaped very powerfully by the perception of internal disorder and revolt, as much as it was shaped by fear of external threat from the northern free states and abolitionists. In fact, in 1817, the inhabitants, freeholders and citizens of the Isle of Wight, County Virginia, petitioned the General Assembly about the, in quotes, evils of slave stealing and requested, in quotes, severe and exemplary punishments to be meted out to perpetrators who they claimed were, in quotes, base and immoral white persons and free persons of colour. Moreover, the petitioners linked this, in quotes, intercourse between slaves and free persons, black and white, to, in quotes, a spirit of disobedience among the enslaved. They predicted it would lead to, in quotes, insurrection and blood. The petitioners of 1817 were not entirely wrong. Their petition can be viewed as an early forewarning to their governors, politicians, and other slave owners about the threat that slave stealers from within their own borders and communities pose to their way of life and the institution of slavery. The subject continued to be hotly contested in private and public discourse, an indication that the seemingly unsolvable problem of slave stealing was a significant factor in the heightening hostility over slavery. Yet, although a link was being drawn between slave stealing and a spirit of disobedience among the enslaved, Southern courts actually struggled to define the precise role of the stolen property in these cases. In the end, they largely excluded the notion of slave resistance, or even some measure of culpability being assigned to the enslaved, as the famous case of Box Brown, a runaway slave, demonstrates, and I'm going to come on to this shortly. Excluding the agency or part of the enslaved in the crime meant the blame was placed solely on free people, poorer whites and free African Americans usually, who were viewed as an insidious internal enemy who threatened slavery and more broadly threatened national property rights. Probably can't read those. I've actually got a magnifying glass. Anyone can see that. We give these out to the students to get them to do history. I'm not sure if it entices them or not. I quite like it, so I take it on research trips with me to read things like this. But I'll run through a little bit of this and some of the most important parts of these advertisements. So what's clear from them, I think, and many of the other records, is that slave owners in these newspaper advertisements in particular like to assume or suppose or wish or believe that their enslaved runaways had not autonomously resisted them, but had actually been stolen, enticed or decoyed. It fitted in with their worldview more easily to have them stolen by a criminal. Therefore, they were willing to give substantial rewards or additional rewards for the capture of not only their runaways, but also the slave stealing enablers or conspirators. We have bits and pieces in here. I'll come to one that's a bit clearer there. So $150 reward, but $50 of that, so a third of that reward is for the apprehension of the thief who was pinned to the absconding slave and pinned to being the focus of how and why that happened. One of the most, I guess, famous runaway slaves, Harriet Jacobs, who wrote a narrative of her life, Incidents of a Slave Girl. Her owner put up an advert for a reward for hoping that she would be returned as a runaway. But within that advert, he also threatens those who would help her. So all persons are hereby forewarned about harbouring or entertaining her, being in any way instrumental in her escape under the most rigorous penalties of law. So again, the threat of being put in prison or fined for effectively what constituted as stealing the enslaved and their labour. The failure to deal with the problem and the anxiety felt by slave owners is evident in these advertisements and rewards for stolen property and for the slave stealers to be found and convicted. Despite the numerous laws that were drafted and ratified over the centuries and across all the southern states, which intended to secure slave property and deter criminals and thieves from taking part, the growing threats of both illegal trafficking and abolitionism ever present, although abolitionism, interestingly, is never mentioned in any of these laws, Despite all of these attempts, all of these threats, slave stealing remained and was persistent and quite prominent. In fact, it proved to be one of the most difficult problems of slave government. Indeed, the scale of these fears is reflected the scale of the problem. The business of, in quotes, forgery and stealing the enslaved and illegally selling them was one of the first types of organised crime, as I said, that existed in America. And the outlaws, bandits and land pirates, as there were different names given for them, who participated were of deep concern. In the second decade of the 19th century, one slave-owning planter claimed that the avaricious and unprincipled were continuously trafficking stolen slaves, passing them on to traders and vendors and producing false titles in order to sell them to unsuspecting or unconcerned buyers. Thus, alongside the Underground Railroad of people helping slaves to escape to freedom, as I said, here existed an underground slave trade comprising of specific networks, routes and accomplices. The increasing commentary on the problem after 1807 and 1808 and the Acts of Abolition reflect a predictable upsurge in slave stealing and prosecutions, obviously after the end of the transatlantic slave trade and that supply of slaves. So the rise of the underground slave trade in many ways accompanied the spread and growth of the domestic slave trade. So just as an example here of, again, of a sort of route of slave stealing and I guess the networks and those involved, in one advertisement, an owner writes, about 2 months ago, after he came into my possession, he told me, the enslaved person, he was stolen from the eastern part of Tennessee and brought around through Arkansas territory to Natchez, where he was sold to John L. Harris, from whom I bought him. He often expressed himself very apprehensive lest he should be stolen again. Interestingly, this advert is actually the enslaved person has then run away. Perhaps their experiences of travel and their experiences during this incident heightened their desire for escape and freedom, and perhaps some of their knowledge of the workings of slavery and the roots of slavery beyond the plantation. So, for example, Lewis Roberts was a legitimate slave dealer. He was based in Lexington, Kentucky. However, he also used the services of slave stealers in rural eastern Kentucky to increase his stocks of enslaved people for sale. So in one of the adverts there, again says probably sold to some Western dealer. Again, the acknowledgement by many that legitimate slave traders and dealers were taking in these stolen enslaved people and using the services of slave stealers. Many slave traders were at the time respected businessmen, yet they often purposefully dabbled in the illegal underground slave trade too. They regularly received stolen slaves from criminal gangs and also stolen slaves that resulted from family feuds, domestic dramas and community conflict. And again, I'll come on to this towards the end of the paper. Lewis Roberts himself and others, when their part in dishonest deals was discovered, were often prosecuted. Regardless of class, race or sex, slave dealers and those involved in the underground slave trade, according to one commentator, assaulted, in quotes, the feeling, interest and patriotism of every Southerner. They breached rights which were, in quotes, guaranteed to us by the solemn compact and the fundamental laws of this government born of the American Revolution. The theft of the enslaved was not simply an attack on an individual owner, but a grand affront to all loyal American citizens and patriots, according to many. Even those in the North and the Union Army thought slave stealing represented a dangerous challenge to individual property rights and a serious attack on the American nation and its government. And I've written a little bit about this in a chapter, in particular what happens just leading up to the Civil War and during the Civil War, and the discomfort of many of those who aren't on the side of slavery about transgressing other men and women's property rights as they viewed it at the time. So again, referred to in the article there, it's not really an advert, about kidnappers and horse thieves going together, talking about the lawlessness of gangs of villains, the regular business of kidnapping slaves and stealing horses, and then being run off to the lower country, selling them in down different routes. But also a comment in that article that it's frequently difficult to procure sufficient proof to convict these slave stealers in a court of justice, but then recommending, and this is in, I think, the 1830s or 40s, that if someone wasn't prosecuted, there wasn't enough evidence, even though he or she were a known thief, that lynch is law, that they were to be lynched by a good citizen to teach them a lesson and to send out a warning that slave stealing wasn't to be tolerated. So again, a very serious crime. Slave stealing was then a collective endeavour on many occasions. Two of the most infamous gangs that stole slaves, as well as kidnapping free African Americans too, were led by Patty Cannon and John Murrel. Their life stories were both published in the 19th century, before the end of slavery and after their convictions. So we have there on the slide the life, well, it's quite interesting actually, the life and adventures of John A. Murrel, the great Western land pirate, which makes him sound quite wholesome on a level, juxtaposed there with the cruel Patty Cannon, the criminal career of an ambitious and bloodthirsty woman, a serial killer. And I'll go on to their crimes in a minute. I'll think about how they're portrayed. I'm not sure that Murrel didn't take part in a vast amount of violence and other criminal activity too. So Patty Cannon's female-led organisation, which participated in numerous criminal activities, operated in Delaware in the 1820s. She and the members of her biracial gang kidnapped and secretly shipped African Americans, enslaved and free, out of Delaware to the deep south, although people looking at Cannon have mostly focused on this sort of Solomon Northup kidnapping free people, free African Americans side of the case. So once they were shipped out of Delaware to the deep south, they were met by collaborators who illegally sold them to those who did not ask questions over deeds of sale or who were willing to accept forgeries. The cruel, ambitious and bloodthirsty Patty Cannon and many members of her gang were caught and prosecuted. Cannon herself and some of the most notorious members were executed for the array of crimes they committed, including murder and slave stealing. The activities of the more wholesome sounding adventurous land pirate John Murrel also won him an infamous reputation in the 19th century. He headed one of the largest gangs, or in quotes, hordes of pirates, which had its headquarters in West Tennessee. The organisation consisted of about 450 members who operated throughout the Mississippi Valley. Their criminal endeavours were, like Patty Cannon, numerous. Murrel was eventually caught and given in 1835 the maximum sentence for the crimes he could be prosecuted for, which evidently wasn't all of them, and this amounted to 10 years in jail. Interestingly, Murrel's organisation, rather than simply stealing slaves and selling them on, sometimes worked in collusion with those they stole. Some enslaved people were stolen repeatedly, being resold several times with their cooperation. The enslaved likely hoped that if they were compliant, they would eventually be freed. This was a common method of maximising profits from slave stealing. Court records and newspapers reveal that individuals as well as gangs employed this strategy. Indeed, the schemes sometimes resulted in freedom for the cooperative. And in this case, and there are others that pop up in the records, the absconding slaves were accompanied by a white man. The white man proved to be a young fellow by the name of Howard from North Carolina, who'd been working in our town at the carpenter's trade. At Decatur, Alabama, he sold one of the boys, pocketed the money and provided him with a pass to join him. And this sort of providing a pass so that the enslaved person can run away and then they can practice the ruse again. Obviously, some of the enslaved people would not have been complicit, and others perhaps would have hoped for freedom if they had a pass to say that they could move freely freely. It was perhaps then their choice whether to rejoin the group, depending on how the theft came about, whether it was collaborative or whether it was forced, or to run to freedom. So other stolen slaves, interestingly, simply joined the gangs who had stolen them. Furthermore, runaways who had voluntarily fled in cahoots with free people also practiced this ruse across the South, presumably in order to make money to aid their escape and journey to freedom. Of course, like the domestic slave trade, which ripped enslaved families apart, many stolen by these gangs of thieves were simply removed from everything they knew, perhaps from family and friends, and mercenarily sold to another owner, and their fate in many cases is unknown. So beyond the large-scale criminal enterprises, there existed many more personalized and localized incidents of slave stealing. Those who worked on slave plantations, neighboring farms, or who lived in surrounding communities were in prime position to steal or entice slaves away from their owners. In 1755, Robert Snow, a South Carolina planter, placed an advertisement in the South Carolina Gazette for a runaway overseer who had taken with him some of the slaves under his supervision. Another reported that 3 enslaved people from a plantation disappeared at the same time as the overseer, Tom West, who was suspected as having, in quotes, carried them into North Carolina, Virginia, or Maryland, and may offer them for sale. The American Revolution and other conflicts provided overseers, bandits, soldiers, and dishonest men and women with an even better opportunity to purloin human property. One planter during the American Revolution claimed that those who took advantage of the disarray caused by conflict and warfare and stole slaves were waging a predatory war on the slave owners and indeed the emerging American nation. Although many were accused of stealing slaves to sell for profit, there were, as slave owners and lawmakers recognized, a number of other motives. Free African Americans who attempted to assist family members to escape slavery could be accused, as the case of Esther Roberts in 1744 illustrates. The free woman was alleged to have stolen her enslaved spouse, Stepney, and placed on trial for her breach of the dividing line between slavery and freedom. Similarly, in 1764, Bowling Stark recounted the theft of his enslaved man, Bob, who was in a sexual relationship with a free white woman. This time, the legal colour line was breached, as well as breaching the line between slavery and freedom. The woman in question fell pregnant and the couple had a child. The pair had not simply breached the laws prohibiting interracial relationships, but slave labour had been lost in the process, which became permanent when the couple absconded. While his enslaver admitted to his correspondent that Bob was a runaway, overall he took the legal stance that Bob had been, in quotes, decoyed away by a white woman, and that his free female lover was to blame. It was claimed that the mingling of poorer free people, black and white, with the enslaved promoted, in quotes, illegal trade and illicit sexual activity. This led to the loss of enslaved labour and more generally threatened social order. Nevertheless, such day-to-day practices and relationships developed in tandem with slavery. In the following century, Duke, a white man who was captured eloping with a slave woman, was charged with slave stealing. Another advertisement offered $1,000 for the capture of a runaway named Celia. The advertisement claimed that she was stolen by Jonathan Coolidge, a Yankee who was living in the South and who had been living for 10 or 15 years as a merchant and a grocer. Allegedly, Celia was willingly, in quotes, taken off to answer the place of wife. I suspect Cecilia was hoping to gain her freedom too. In 1843, Newsom Lowry was serving his time in the penitentiary near Richmond, Virginia. In the court case, his wife and others provided details of Newsom's illicit intercourse, as it was claimed, with an enslaved woman named Cynthia. Apparently, the couple made their escape, but Cynthia was captured. Despite the dangers, Newsom Lowry returned to Richmond in an attempt to free Cynthia, and was himself captured and convicted as a slave stealer. And again, just I put up advertisements, mostly just because the court cases are very large. It'd be hard to put them up on a PowerPoint, but this is sort of just a snippet of the material that's out there. So in this case, the aggrieved party, whose enslaved person had allegedly been stolen, said, "There is no doubt the thief will dress her in boy's clothes and attempt to pass her off, as he was seen the day after he left with her, with a boy in possession which he said he had purchased, but was no doubt the above described girl. It is presumed that he will make for one of the non-slave holding states," so the indication they're going to freedom, that this is a collaborative effort, a friendship or maybe a sexual relationship. There's no proof, of course. Interestingly, this is one of the many tactics that we use, and there's all sorts of things that happen in order to try and disguise the stolen enslaved people. So throughout slavery, groups of enslaved people, poor whites and free African Americans, mingled, and individuals formed relationships, social and economic. In doing so, they challenged slave owners and the institution of slavery and the laws that they had passed about these dividing lines. And as a consequence, they frequently ended up in the courtroom charged with slave stealing. In 1775, Braithwaite maintained a disorderly house, which, in quotes, entertains and harbours the enslaved. Anne sold alcohol and offered the chance to game at cards. It sounds like my kind of place. I love a good game of cards. So Anne drew revenue from her disorderly house from selling alcohol and gaming at cards indiscriminately. And she welcomed men and women from all walks of life. However, the authorities took a dim view of her business activities, and she was placed on trial for, in quotes, enticing the enslaved away from their work. Anne was to be punished for effectively stealing and converting slave owners' lost labour and expense into her own profit. Early in the colonial period, many juries and communities, like the citizens later on of the Isle of Wight County, grew weary of those who, despite condemnation and the threat of punishment, transgressed boundaries of race and the law. Interestingly, as I have mentioned, slave codes and acts of law completely excluded the notion of slave agency or culpability, even when it was clear that the crime could not have taken place without the consent or cooperation of the enslaved. Thus, both acts of petty slave stealing and the larger efforts of gangs and thieves of the underground slave trade were often wholesale perceived in racialized terms. Racist contemporaries viewed slave stealing as a crime in which, in quotes, hapless black chattel was stolen by white criminals. This interpretation of slave stealing neatly accommodated established notions of white hegemony, even if the reality was a very different story, one that in fact indicated that many people willingly crossed racial boundaries rather than bolstered them, and through their daily actions and associations challenged slavery. Indeed, one of the most famous escapes in American history is that of Henry Box Brown, as I said. However, it is also a slave stealing case, which illuminates the many complexities surrounding this crime. While enslaved Henry Brown was in contact with anti-slavery societies, the white man who proved pivotal to his escape cannot be categorized as an abolitionist, though his part in the escape landed him in jail. Henry Brown, while a slave, asked Samuel Smith, a white shoemaker, to nail him into a wooden shipping crate and send him to Virginia, to Philadelphia's anti-slavery offices. The case is famous as a successful slave escape, and Henry Brown toured the US and the UK as an abolitionist speaker and then settled in England. However, after the escape, the Virginian authorities ardently pursued those thieves who, in quotes, aided and abetted the enslaved man. Samuel Smith was soon arrested for his involvement, put on trial for slave stealing, which is in his record, in his criminal record in the penitentiary. He was found guilty and punished. Yet the story is more complicated still. Samuel Smith was also someone who betrayed runaways to the authorities in exchange for the reward. The economic agenda or imperative that many poorer white Southerners shared sometimes encouraged them to work with slave owners if it resulted in financial gain. Yet his status, his trade, and his leisure habits, in particular gambling and running an illegal lottery, meant that he was daily in contact with enslaved people, in particular enslaved craftspeople and tradesmen, and built up personal relationships with them, which evidently led him into the world of slave stealing. Those who had daily contact with the enslaved and became involved in their lives did not necessarily consider themselves, as I said, either criminals or abolitionists. However, slave owners and lawmakers had a very different stance. Indeed, the slave stealers that most frequently grabbed the nation's attention were abolitionists. These slave-stealing men and women had a more pointedly humanitarian and political purpose and, again, came from and worked together across the legal colour line. Their activities broke numerous state and federal laws. The most famous abolitionists of the day, such as William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman, who's also had a film about her recently, so if you haven't seen it, it's really good, do watch it. These abolitionists worked together, aiding or stealing the enslaved to freedom, and they've received much, rightly so, attention. They were national heroes and heroines, but to others at the time, they were notorious criminals. Abolitionists presented a twofold danger. They deprived enslavers of their property, and they also attempted to overthrow the institution at the core of Southern society. Much of the work on this category of slave stealers has focused on slave escapes across the Ohio or heading north to the Free States or Canada. However, the Underground Railroad operated all over the South and Southwest. Using slave stealing to uncover cases that remain buried in the court records, especially in the Deep South, expands our knowledge of these local operations and less familiar routes to freedom. For instance, the story of Jonathan Walker, or, in quotes, the man with the branded hand, as he became known, offers insight into slave escapes south, in this case, out of the Gulf of Mexico. After being found guilty, Walker was sentenced to jail time, and also as part of his punishment, he was branded with the letters SS on his hand for slave stealing. Walker's efforts represent just one of many which remain undiscovered. In fact, Walker's story and the details of these alternative routes to freedom only came to light when he was captured in 1844 and put on trial for slave stealing. At this point, he not only appears in the legal record, but was brought into the limelight as a hero when the abolitionists produced a pamphlet about him. They also produced a poem about him too. Not my favourite rhyming couplets, but do read it. So, another lesser known abolitionist whose story also came to the fore after being captured by the authorities was Delia Webster. She attracted notoriety after she worked with Calvin Fairbank, helping enslaved runaways in Kentucky. In 1844, the same year as Walker was prosecuted, the pair were captured and tried for their crimes. The law dealt with Fairbank much more harshly than Webster, being viewed as a much more dangerous threat to slavery and Southern patriarchy too. He was sentenced to 15 years in the penitentiary. Delia Webster, due to her sex, was dealt with more sympathetically, which in many ways allowed her to become a much more effective agent of the abolitionist cause. After her capture, like Fairbank, she was placed on trial. However, usurping the agency of female abolitionists. In the courtroom, the all-male prosecutors conformed to gender stereotypes. They claimed women like Webster, who were, in quotes, naturally dependent and therefore cajoled and misguided by men rather than consciously protesting slavery. Intriguingly, the jury of married men, rather than convict Webster, first asked for her to be pardoned in quotes on account of her sex, but Webster refused to sign this document. Still, she was sentenced to only 2 years in the Kentucky penitentiary, and after merely 2 months, she was pardoned and released. Her trial and punishment for slave stealing had not deterred her, and she audaciously returned to Kentucky, the state that had convicted her, and resumed her abolitionist activities. She was arrested and jailed again in 1854, and this time Webster escaped to Indiana, where the authorities later captured her and imprisoned her. They placed her on trial again under the 1850 Federal Fugitive Slave Act. However, this time the judge discharged the case because of a lack of evidence. Webster continued to aid enslaved runaways after this and operate as part of the Underground Railroad. She also served as a nurse for the Union in the Civil War. So in this case, societal perceptions of women as the weaker, inferior sex could work in their favour. In Delia Webster's case, the swift commutation of her sentence afforded her the opportunity to quickly resume slave stealing, while her accomplice lingered in jail, his pleas for a pardon repeatedly denied. Indeed, of the two, she proved to be the much more successful and dangerous slave stealer. Similarly, but on the other side of the law, slave-owning women, married and single, often became embroiled in slave-stealing cases. These women filed numerous suits to county courts across the South, focused on the theft and misappropriation of their enslaved people. Their petitions and part in the legal proceedings further highlight the contradictions of race slavery and patriarchy that pervaded the Southern states. Whether the culprits were their husbands, kin, or acquaintances, slave-owning women fought to maintain their enslaved property and also bring to account those who contravened their rights as slave owners. Some who battled with felonious families and slave stealers from their communities filed petitions that stated that their slaves had been casually lost, the legal term describing the contention that slave property had illegally fallen into the hands of another person by unknown means. In Georgia, Jane Ward and Sarah Gray collectively owned 11 slaves. They petitioned the county court claiming the slaves had been casually lost and unlawfully come into the possession of Joseph Gray, a relative of Sarah's, who refused to return them and instead, in quotes, converted and disposed of the said slaves to his own use and benefit. Jane and Sarah sued for $6,000 in damages for this theft. Family members persistently attempted to infringe upon the rights and the property rights of their kin, in particular female relatives. In 1833, Frances Clure, an illiterate Virginian widow, who stated that she was, in quotes, entirely unacquainted with transacting the business of slavery, was tricked by her nephew. He first claimed her enslaved people were about to be confiscated to settle her late husband's debts, and then, in quotes, artfully and fraudulently convinced her to sign her enslaved people over to him for her protection. The nephew was not working alone, and his partners quickly, in quotes, under the cover of night, claimed, took, and carried away her slaves from her plantation. Frances asked the court to annul the deed and return her stolen slaves. The court granted her request. Much further south in Mobile, Alabama, a controversy erupted over the enslaved grandson of a free, wealthy African-American woman named Margaret Collins. Margaret was a well-known slave owner. Her son, also a free African-American, had an affair with one of his mother's enslaved women. The woman fell pregnant, and therefore Margaret's grandson was also her enslaved property. She placed her enslaved grandson in the care of his aunt. However, rather than treating him as a relative and her nephew, the boy's aunt hired him out as a slave. In her petition, Margaret Collins demanded the court interject to prevent her grandson being sold out of state and have him returned to her. Also, she expected her daughter to be forced to pay her ill-gotten proceeds from hiring out her grandson back to her. Even closer to home, husbands regularly stole their wives' slaves. Many husbands acted out of sheer greed, while others, as we have seen, were having relationships with enslaved women who they stole, including those owned by their wives. Regardless of their wives' interests, they evidently viewed the theft or misuse of their wives' enslaved people as a legitimate act. Surprisingly, bearing in mind the power of husbands, many Southern legislators, judges, and juries did not agree with the husbands' opinions of their rights to their wives' property, and they supported the slave-owning women and their independent right to own enslaved property. Mary Owens petitioned the courts in July 1841, stating that her husband, while drunk and without provocation, beat her mercilessly, and in one episode took a shot at her and missed, but hit a dog instead. Sounds like a great guy, as the ex-President Trump might say. So Mary took refuge at her mother's house. Since then, her husband had sold off her property, and on the death of her mother, he informed his wife that he intended to, in quotes, secret away and sell her enslaved people. Still married, but without familial protection, Mary Owens asked that she be granted a divorce and protection to prevent her slaves from being stolen. A year later, an attack on the property of Elizabeth Gray had an even more serious consequence. John P. Fox, her second husband, forged a bill of sale for her slaves, which she had inherited from her first husband when he died. Fox then sold the stolen slaves and disappeared. The enslaved people were found in the possession of slave traders Edward and Robert Crutchfield, who were legitimate slave traders. Elizabeth, who had children, petitioned for restoration of her stolen slaves, and the court ruled in her favour. Married women with children, left at the mercy of thieving husbands, were in a precarious situation, and thus the courts regularly interceded to defend them and their property rights against their husbands. Minors who were orphaned but allowed to marry were a very tempting target for slave-stealing suitors. In 1850, in Kentucky, Flora Cheatham, a minor, petitioned the Bedford County Court in Tennessee, claiming her husband had plotted with his father to steal her slaves. The father and son, in quotes, secretly and fraudulently abducted her enslaved man, Porter, and sold him to a legal slave trader. When discovered, the slave trader, Joseph Thompson, decided that he should have Porter, in quotes, mysteriously spirited away by his son, who took him to be hidden by another slave trader named William Little. Flora declared that she never agreed to the sale, and she asked for payment and restitution. And again, her request was granted by the courts. Finally, it was not only women who were targeted by family and acquaintances. Many preyed on ignorance of the legal framework of slavery. The enslaved property of those who were illiterate or unfamiliar with the paperwork related to the different slave financing schemes was often casually lost and commonly stolen. In 1840, Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence fell into debt and mortgaged their enslaved woman Tempe and her son John Solomon to a man named John Fisher in exchange for the money to pay their debts. However, in quotes, not understanding the form of a mortgage, they were duped into signing a bill of sale instead. Indeed, the sum in the document that they signed amounted to the exact debt of the Lawrences and was much, much less than the value of the enslaved people, which helps to explain the ease with which the deceit was passed. 2 years later, the Lawrences, having paid back the money for the mortgage, requested the return of their mortgaged slaves. Fisher denied their request, claiming he had purchased the slaves rather than transacted a loan through a mortgage. He then hastily sold Tempe to William Little, the dubious slave trader involved in the case of the miner Flora Cheatham. William Little straight away took the enslaved women out of state and beyond the reach of the Lawrences. Clearly, the underground slave trade did not just utilize career criminals and gangs, but also thrived on family feuds, fraud, and community conflict over slave ownership. Nevertheless, the Lawrences appealed to the court, asking for William Fisher to be punished and to receive damages for their stolen property. The court agreed, and they were compensated. In the South, the authorities and governors, who were mostly wealthy slave owners, clearly understood that poorer, small-scale slaveholders were often an easy target for slave stealers and needed defending. However, those who did not own any slaves at all presented a more serious danger, as we've seen. They could be seduced into joining slave-stealing gangs, or perhaps worse, joining abolitionists. Indeed, in the decades before the Civil War, this awareness encouraged slave owners to think about forging stronger social consensus across the white South. Slave-owning citizens of states such as North Carolina even debated passing laws that involved the redistribution of newly enslaved free blacks and slaves owned by the state, and this redistribution would be to give these enslaved people to non-slave owners to bring them into the fold and discourage them from joining slave-stealing gangs or anti-slavery ventures. They clearly hoped that by offering them a vested interest in slavery, poorer members of white society who worked alongside, socialized, and conspired with the enslaved would conform to the slaveholder regime and stop transgressing. Indeed, they clearly hoped this would eradicate local threats to their property and heal the fissures that divided the white South. Increasingly cognizant of potential class conflict, as tensions mounted between the slave South and the free states of the North, prosecuting and punitively punishing Southern men and women as slave stealers became a contentious issue. Unified support across the South was necessary to allow for a robust defense of slavery. In 1856, Alex Smith, a Virginian planter, wrote to a friend regarding a case of, in quotes, kidnappers who stole a number of slaves from the district in 1847, so the district being Washington, D.C. Smith recalled that, in quotes, the abductors of the slaves were arrested and tried and found guilty. Maryland laws operated in this area, and so the crime was, in quotes, punished by fine and imprisonment if the fine should not be paid. The penalty amounted to $12,000, which these Southern slave stealers, the planter noted, in quotes, were unable to pay and were consequently incarcerated according to the law, where they remained a decade later. He felt that as the Southern men were poor, they were being punished for their poverty and not their crime. As, he noted, in quotes, if they had been rich, they could not have been confined to a day in jail, but being poor, they were likely to rot in prison under these circumstances. In a pointed attack on rich Northern abolitionists who paid fines easily for slave stealing and then continued their work, he defended his poor, white, misguided brethren, as did other Southern slave owners and citizens in the lead-up to the war. Thus, in a concerted effort to construct a cohesive defense of the South, many Southerners who would have previously applauded the severe punishment of anyone, Northern or Southern, from any state who was caught stealing slaves, they began to rethink their stance and adapt their attitudes. Many Southerners felt that conciliation among white Southerners was an important part and probably as important as their conflict with the North. This was quite a different view to that held by colonial slave owners and lawmakers who supported the death penalty for slave stealing. So just a quick example here. and this is some work I've got to do in the future. You see there, well, it's a larger version here, that we have this is a penitentiary record, the prison records, and it denotes on the side the crime, and this was someone called Mr. Purnell, who was from South Carolina, so a southerner who was prosecuted for slave stealing, and it actually says slave stealing. Again, you might need my magnifying glass to see that. He was a blacksmith, so a tradesperson, 32 years old, a white male, and he was in Kentucky when he was caught and prosecuted for that crime. So we can see they're going across state borders, and he's number 17 in that case. So to conclude then, the diversity of incidences of slave stealing demonstrate the ambivalent nature of Southern law and custom when dealing with those who stole human property and also those it affected. Clearly many proved willing to break or manipulate the laws of slavery in order to advance their own interests, be those interests monetary, emotional, or ideological. Against the backdrop of growing sectional conflict, slave stealing, an activity which already existed in the grey area between crime and social protest, acquired a clear political dimension. It forced wealthy slave owners to consider the cohesiveness of Southern society and raised worrying concerns about the security of small-scale slaveholders. It also raised concerns about the loyalty of non-slaveholding whites and those living on the margins. Though their involvement has largely been ignored, in particular slave-stealing women and slave-owning women, despite their differing agendas, played a significant part in slave-stealing cases, often aided by assumptions about their gender. The latter allowed slave stealers and victims of the theft to manipulate an otherwise constraining patriarchal authority, to challenge gender conventions, and also to resist slavery. These women exposed the fragility of constructions of identity that underpins social and political authority in the South. Slave stealing, then, was quite clearly an omnipresent component of the South's psychological preparation for the momentous act of secession. It brought into focus the precarious position of the wealthy slave-owning class, having built a society that rested on racial inequality and the subjugation of the enslaved. Widespread participation in a variety of acts of theft, many of which amount to resistance, were daily reminders that numerous people were willing to defy codes and dogmas of race, class, and gender that govern society. In particular, the lives of those who have been placed at the edges of slavery come into much clearer focus. The, in quotes, immoral and disloyal poor whites, the disorderly women and free blacks, the disobedient enslaved people. Through their actions, through slave stealing, heightened fears of attack, revolt, and the overthrow of the institution that formed the bedrock of Southern society. In doing so, slave stealers, whatever their motivations, protest, protection, or profit, shaped antebellum political thought and contributed to the anxieties and contradictions that drove a very conservative Southern society to take the very radical and ultimately fatal decision to go to war to defend slavery. So that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Laura, for a fascinating, very full and rich summary of an issue which I think hasn't been anywhere near as enough studied as it should be. We have a variety of questions, but just want to encourage the audience if they'd like to submit questions, either to do so directly in the chat function where they'll be passed on to me, or if you'd like to raise a question. Like to raise a question directly, please let me know as well. We have a couple of questions. One from Judith Bikesley. There's a question for you, Laura. She asked, you talked about the theft of slaves by husbands from their wives not being supported in court. Did this distinguish, Judith asks, this type of property from other forms of property?
Well, I think that the point that I was trying to make there is that and it's different for every southern state, so there's a lot to take in, and obviously I've got a lot of work still to do. Is that generally courts, in terms of any property, would see that it was the jurisdiction of the husband once married. So although you might own the enslaved people and bring them to the marriage, and your property, any other property and money that you brought with you in a dowry became the under control of your husband. But in these incidences, it proves the opposite, that often courts won't allow divorces for certain crimes, and they don't sue in favour of wives very frequently for divorce or other issues. But in this instance, the court seems to regularly want to defend property rights of slave-owning women, even though often actually legally their husbands really should control that enslaved property, their right through marriage. But instead, when it seemed to be dangerous to the household, because it's slave stealing, to be supporting the notion that actually taking someone else's slave away from them, so it's taking them out of the household, not within the household, it's when they take them out of the household and either sell them or take them to another state or use them for a purpose that doesn't benefit that household, it becomes a theft. And so in those cases, the juries and the judges, which is quite unusual, to go in favour of the wife maintaining her control over her own property, which still legally, unless she's divorced, should be in the control of her husband. So that's the sort of contradiction, or the level I think that courts would go to. They would prefer to support property rights of women than they would prefer to support husbands' rights and patriarchy.
Interesting. We've got a question which follows on pretty much very closely to that. Susan Capes asked, is it possible to suggest what proportion of people who were the victims of slave stealing were women?
I can't guess at this stage, because I've only gone through like a third of all the information I have. So I'd hate to say that and have it recorded, and then I turn around in a year's time and say I was totally wrong. But I would say in the county court records I'm looking at, more of the cases, many more of them, are about women than men, actually. And often the women are suing for a divorce too. And if the case is about slave stealing and a divorce,
can you guess the ratio?
Maybe 2/3 are about female. I've actually just written an article about this, so if you wait for bated breath, it will be out in about a year, about slave stealing women, and there's a lot more to it. I only put a little bit in this paper, and slave owning women who have their property stolen, and I wrote it solely on women because there were so many cases. Actually, what I was going to say, Trevor, is often if women are suing for a divorce, they don't get the divorce unless they've got their husband's been a slave stealer too. He has to, even if he's done something really awful, and there's lots of detail and information and support for that woman. If slave stealing is in there, I'd say 9 out of 10 times a wife gets the divorce as well as restitution and the property return or the money for that.
Which does say something about how seriously this is taken in antebellum South. We have a question which pushes us out a bit comparatively. It comes from David Richardson, and he asks, what evidence is there that slave stealing raised similar concerns in Caribbean slave societies, where slave reproduction and internal slave trafficking were far less prevalent than in the southern mainland colonies and later states?
So I don't know the answer to that question, because I haven't done any work on the Caribbean, because I work on mainland North America. I mean, in some ways, it's interesting. I mean, this isn't relevant, I suspect, to answer your question. I'd like to know, so if anyone who wants to do this project in the Caribbean, Trevor, I'm looking at you right now through our Zoom screen, or anyone else, I think it might be more constraining in a sense. I think in the mainland, there's a lot of people who are not benefiting from slavery and who are poor. There's a big white population. There's actually quite, much larger, I guess, than the Caribbean population of free people of color or free African Americans. And so some of this criminality, I think, comes about from a sort of larger demographic of people who aren't enslaved. They are free, but they're not participating or able to participate in the economy of slavery. And so they're trying to make money from it in an alternative and evidently criminal way.
Right.
So, interestingly, after, it's sort of related to the Caribbean, but it's not an answer to that question. It's to the Jonathan Walker case. Is that after the emancipation of slavery in the Caribbean, I found several cases. The Jonathan Walker one's just interesting because of the branded hand and the pamphlet, of slaves being stolen or taken out of the South. Some being taken to the Caribbean, and some seem to be taken or stolen, not to freedom, to be taken, and I don't know what they're going to do with them because slavery's over. But so there's a sort of a kind of increase perhaps of removing people illegally, removing enslaved people, stealing them and taking them south and out into the Caribbean at that point.
Well, that sounds like a great research topic. Nick Evans asks, can you elaborate further about the identities of the people found to be stealing slaves? For example, he asked, were the Scots more likely to appear in slave stealing? I guess that sort of suggests some of the older ideas about Scots and horse stealing and the borders and those sorts of things. But so were the Scots, Irish, what types of people were involved in slave stealing?
So, I mean, I'll go to my 18th century roots to try and answer this, because I hesitate to decide whether someone's Scottish or Irish when they're born in America in the 19th century. But I mean, we can go into that as well if you want. But in the 18th century, there do seem to be a higher proportion of people who are Irish or who maybe have are indentured or have been ex-indentured servants. So they are mentioned. There are Scottish, Irish, Dutch also in these cases, and in the newspaper records of people stealing slaves, and they're called thieves, and they're you know, it's all put out there as a crime, but you know, you've got to wonder, and some you can trace, very few, as to whether these people collaborated and ran away, you know, like the case of Tom West. But yeah, there are, I think it's migrants going to the colonies, and who are again not able to take part in that you know, mythical American dream, and they're working alongside enslaved people in towns and cities and on plantations. And I think, you know, obviously the work that I did that Trevor mentioned about overseers, there's still a lot to be done on who's on the plantation in the colonial era, whether they're indentured or not. And there are people coming in and out, in particular tradespeople and artisans. I've got my artisan overseers, etc. And so I think it's these kind of people who do end up slave stealing, maybe for money, because they can, because the opportunity is there, or they're collaborating. They're gonna run away from that. Yeah, I think the people who end up in those roles, I talked about the migration of people across the Atlantic, as other people have, not actually finding work easily in the South, and then working on the plantation as an overseer or an artisan or something like that, and then sort of becoming familiar and thinking, well, what's the next option? Perhaps I'm not going to be a planter, or you know, perhaps what I was here for is not going to happen. Maybe I'll leave, and maybe I'll leave with the enslaved people I'm working with.
Rebecca Bloomfield asks, is there any evidence of why, of who was in the courtroom when these cases were being held? For example, were abolitionists likely to pack the courtroom in the 1850s to speak out against slave owning?
I can't really answer that. I can tell you, I mean, so the court records, some of them are really big as well, so they're really interesting, but they only really contain the details of anyone who is making a statement about the crime, about the criminal, anything at all about the case. There isn't really anything in those records about who's in the courtroom, although of course for the abolitionist ones, we know for some of them, yeah, the courtroom would be packed. It's just that we don't know whether in more sort of county-wide cases. I have seen one or two reported in the press, which would indicate that if it got to the press, then perhaps they were cases where people had a more popular interest, and so they did or could attend. But that's the best I can probably do to work out who was in the courtroom on a county court level, because it just doesn't say in the court cases.
Okay, great. Judith would like to ask you a question in person. Judith?
Thanks, Laura. Fascinating, really fascinating. I wanted to ask you, because when you talked about this, when I've looked at illegal enslavement, as you mentioned, in other parts of the world, there's usually a distinction between those two things. So I've seen sort of records about slave stealing, and it appears in law codes in the medieval period and others as well. So we know that it was going on at all sorts of different times, but it's not. It's always tends to be separated from the illegal enslavement of free people. You know, so there's a distinction between the two, and as far as I can tell from what you're saying, they're sort of come into this big category of slave stealing in your work. And
actually, they don't really. They don't. I mean, I guess what the point I was trying to make is the slave stealers will steal both free African Americans and slaves, the gangs and the people who are just out for it. And I think they can do that because of the racial element to it. Because you know, I can steal a free person like Solomon Northup. I can take him south, and I can say he was a slave, and I can forge a bill of sale. But in terms of the law, stealing someone's slave property, I think the South in particular, but generally because it's someone's property, and a free person of color or a free African American isn't someone's property, is actually a much more serious and different crime. So slave stealing is different from stealing a free African American, but slave stealers, I think, who work together, who are more of the criminal enterprise and who want to sell them into slavery, will do both.
Oh, I'd misunderstood that. Yeah, no, I'd misunderstood. Sorry, that makes more sense. And there is an interesting element, as you pointed out, to follow on from that I'd welcome a comment on. That if you, certainly in the medieval period, if you wanted a slave, because there wasn't a racialization of slavery as such, it was easier to kidnap anybody to sell into slavery, which of course wasn't quite the same. So I wonder if there was more of a problem that was recorded in terms of the stealing of free Americans in that particular point in time that we don't see elsewhere, so that there's more of it, if you like, that's recorded. I don't know what your feeling is on that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think lots of it gets recorded. I was surprised because this project came out of my other project, and I had never even really thought about it until I saw some overseers and their wives stealing slaves. I think it's that there is a look. There's something that people are looking out for. Is that person a slave owner? What are they doing with someone who's potentially a slave? In the South, most non-white people are enslaved. There are free African Americans, so I think it's more visually something where people are more aware. And so they can kind of capture these thieves more easily, in a sense, because there's something that stands out, which is, of course, been put into law, which is the racial dynamic. So I think you're right. I think it's perhaps easier to catch slave stealers, which is why there's lots and lots of cases, because this person is with someone who they clearly don't own, or they possibly don't own. And again, if you don't have the bit of paper that goes with it, you're definitely sort of in trouble.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Laura.
Thank you. We have two final questions. One from Sherilyn Haggerty, and she asks that you mentioned in your paper that enslavers did not want to accept that the enslaved had left willingly. Do you think this is because, she asks, they deemed them purely property because they didn't want to think of the enslaved as unhappy, or because they thought of themselves as paternalistic? So this refers, I guess, to long-standing debates within antebellum slavery about paternalism, paternalistic, the ideas of property and those sorts of things.
Yeah, definitely. I think they don't on any level want to, whether the paternalism, for some of them, I think they don't want to believe that enslaved people want to leave or run away or would dare resist them or would want to resist them. And then I think on a kind of broader level, thinking about resistance, I think it frightens them, the idea that perhaps these people, would run away, they would be in collaboration. Is this going to be, another sort of rebellion, of the early colonial era of free white people and free African Americans and the enslaved? So I think there's an element of it that's sort of denial in terms of what the experience of an enslaved person who you think that you're paternalistic towards. But I also think there's a level where they don't want to publicly admit that fear inside, that actually there's a lot of people who aren't taking part in the system of slavery and could potentially threaten it.
Okay. We have a comment from Adrian Nikolai Fortuna, and then a question from Sam North, and then perhaps you might be finished there. Adrian says, thanks you for your presentation, and says that he sees so many similarities with Roma slavery in Romania. And Sam asks, and perhaps being the final question, and it follows on from Judith's question, did you find other cases of people being stolen other than the enslaved?
Well, I did find cases of free African Americans being stolen. I didn't really find any cases of. Actually, I mean, I tell a lie. Of course, I did. I'm thinking about the later part of the project. So wide. Obviously at the beginning of the project, when I was looking at colonial America, I found Native Americans being stolen, and that there's quite a bit of work been done on that, and also some indentured servants. And so this law, the very first law about slave stealing, is actually about stealing indentured servants and slaves. The very earliest law that's passed about the crime. So yeah, I did find some of that, very scant information. But again, it brings us back to the sort of broader theme of theft of human beings, and what that means, and who takes part and doesn't take part in slavery, and whether they want to economically profit in some way, or whether they feel that their social interactions mean that they're not interested either, but would happily collaborate or help people to resist or free themselves.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think we could probably go on for much longer, but we've had quite a long time already, and I think the number of questions shows the amount of interest in this particularly fascinating topic. And I think it says something about how, in looking at slavery, that we're developing research which goes well beyond master-slave relationships into the ways that slavery has a connection and impact on all aspects of society, in this case antebellum slavery. And we appreciated, I think, also the ways that you connected slave stealing to some of the ideologies around slavery that helped to lead to the American Civil War. So this is going to be a very interesting project. So thank you very much, Laura, for this fascinating presentation today and for joining us here. And we wish you well for developing this into a further work. So thank you very much for that. And thank you very much to the audience for attending today. It's great to see you. And just to mention our next seminar, which is on the 20th of May, once again at 4 o'clock. And this is by Dr. Jelmer Vos, lecturing global history at the University of Glasgow. And Jelmer will be talking about unfree labour in the Angolan coffee economy between 1830 and 1960. So we hope that you can join us then. But thank you very much, Laura, for the fascinating talk, and thank you very much to the audience for attending today. Thank you.
Thanks.